Welcome, dear friends. Today's guest, Father Uwe Michael Lang, is a priest of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri in London. He holds a doctorate in theology from the University of Oxford and is a senior lecturer in liturgy and church history at St. Mary's University, Twickenham and Allen Hall Seminary, London. Father Lang served as a staff member of the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments from 2008 to 2012, and he was a consultor to the Office for the Liturgical Celebrations of the Supreme Pontiff from 2008 to 2013. Father Lang is a prolific writer, and his many works include Turning Toward the Lord, A Short History of the Roman Mass, and he's also an editor of The Genius of the Roman Rite. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Father Lang on today's interview. Welcome, Father Lang. It's my pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. Very happy to have this interview with you.
Father, in Singapore, we do not have any Oratorians. Can you briefly share about your order and the spirituality?
Well, the Oratory was founded in Rome in the 16th century by Saint Philip Neri, who was priest originally from Florence, but then spent most of his life in Rome. And in fact, we are not a religious order. We are a congregation of secular priests living in community. So we are not, technically speaking, religious. We are not part of the consecrated life. And also, we have the particular aspect that each house is independent, so we don't have the centralized structure of a religious order. So we're a community of mainly priests. There are some lay brothers as well, but it's mainly priests living in community. So we have elements of the religious life, life in community, but without the vows, and we mainly dedicated to the essential priestly ministries. First place, prayer, sacraments, preaching in the widest possible sense, so sacramental instruction, catechism, and then we can really take on any priestly life, any priestly work, which can be in schools, hospitals, prisons, and I also teach at a St. Mary's University and Allen Hall Seminary. And the Oratory is particularly important for England because in the 19th century, when the Catholic Church had its second spring after the very difficult period following the Protestant Reformation, and the Oratory was very much part of that. It was introduced into England by St. John Henry Newman. He founded the first Oratory in England in Birmingham. And so it's very much associated with that kind of rebirth of the Catholic Church in England. So oratories in England have a greater profile than in other countries.
I see, Father. Thank you for sharing. Father, I noticed that in this particular book, A Short History of the Roman Mass, in your preface, you actually dedicated the work to the late Pope Benedict XVI. I'm sure it must have been a great influence for you personally. So we'd like to share how you describe his contributions in the aspect of sacred liturgy and personally for you.
Well, the Sacred Liturgy was very central to Pope Benedict's life and work as a theologian, as a scholar, but then also as, of course, as a priest, as a bishop, a cardinal, and then as Pope. He really founded it the soul of all theology, and he was not a liturgical scholar by training or by specialization, so theologian, fundamental theologian, but his work often really recurs to the liturgy because the Church's worship is essentially about our relationship with God, our orientation towards God. And for him, that was essential in every aspect of the Christian life and also of Christian thought. So when his collected works were published in 2008, the first volume came out in 2008, he explicitly wanted the first volume to be that on theology of the liturgy rather than the first volume in the actual series. And so that was the first 2000. And he wrote a preface to that volume in which he sort of sums up what the liturgy means for him and how central it is to his thought and his life. And it's interesting that that preface is actually very similar to what he wrote in the mid-60s when he was a theologian and expert peritus at the Second Vatican Council. So you see the continuity of his thought on the liturgy and how it shaped really his life.
I see. Yes, Father, Pope Benedict XVI, it's also a very instrumental figure for me in my own formation. I've been an altar boy for more than a decade growing up. And, as an altar boy, the liturgy has a special place in our hearts. But when I chanced upon his writings, it really opened my mind. The way he articulated the faith was so beautiful. Yeah. And because of that, I began collecting his works. Yeah, and I know many people have actually said that if he were to be canonized one day as a saint, he would definitely be a doctor of the church one day. Are these your sentiments as well, Father?
I would think so, yes, certainly, because his work, his writings are really so enlightening and profound on a huge variety of subjects, actually, not just the liturgy, but there's such a broad spectrum from classical themes of dogmatic theology to the engagement of Christianity with the world, ethics, sort of political philosophy. It's really extraordinary how broad his thought was.
Yeah. In one of the numerous quotes of him, he said this: I am convinced that the crisis in the church that we are experiencing today is, to a large extent, due to the disintegration of the liturgy. Father, these are quite big words that he's saying. And he said, and we often hear that the current liturgical praxis in the church is starkly different from what had been promulgated in Sacrosanctum Concilium. And Pope Benedict XVI, as a peritus at the Second Vatican Council, would have been a first-hand witness in terms of the implementation of the reform of the liturgy. I'm just curious, how did this renewal or reform that was intended by the Second Vatican Council actually led to unwarranted liturgical experimentation and abuses even that ensued in the wake of the council?
It seems to me the problem was the historical context in which the reforms were implemented. This was the 1960s, which was the time of great social upheaval in the West, so in Europe, in North America. There was a lot of social unrest. There was a lot of social change, even a kind of sort of revolutionary dynamic. And the liturgical reform got sort of caught up in that. And you have the very clear and sound principles of Sacrosanctum Concilium, the Second Vatican Council's constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, which is in many ways actually in continuity with Pope Pius XII's liturgy encyclical Mediator Dei, with some different accents, some development, but an essential continuity. And the impulses for liturgical reform, yes, but they were very soon sort of caught up in this general feverish atmosphere that sort of everything had to be sort of created anew. And so a dynamic of liturgical rupture really was created that went far beyond what Sacrosanctum Concilium envisaged. So a lot of it seemed that the liturgy was in a field of experimentation, of anything goes, of cultural forms, musical forms were adopted, which you had never before in the liturgy. And then, of course, Rome tried to steer that and to keep some control over the process. But it did lead to a kind of liturgical anarchy for a while. Now, of course, that didn't come from nowhere. I think we must also look back at the situation before the Second Vatican Council, which was by no means ideal. One shouldn't sort of glorify a particular historical epoch, really. And so there were all sorts of ideas around that, I guess, facilitated this the radical changes. But I think it's the general context that accelerate the process so much that the actual documents of the council, the texts of the council, were sort of soon forgotten, and one went sort of far beyond anything envisaged there.
Yes, growing up, so we're already in the post-conciliar period. So for me, I'm used to seeing the mass that was celebrated in a particular fashion, which encouraged kind of some liturgical creativity in the mass, right? Where you have priests who might be giving his commentary at the start of mass without going straight into the liturgical rites. And over time, Father, because the liturgy is such an important place, like what you say is the heart and soul of theology, and so inevitably we are either formed or deformed by that which we experience. Wouldn't you say that, Father?
We certainly are. I mean, the liturgy is meant to express our faith and the way we live that faith, but also shapes that faith. I mean, most people don't read works of theology. I mean, why should they? Many Catholics do try to feed their faith by reading the scriptures and reading spiritual writings. But I think the major factor in shaping our understanding of the faith is the way we worship, what we encounter when we go to Sunday Mass. So it has a kind of teaching function, which is not necessarily expressed in the actual preaching or instruction, but in the way it's celebrated, in the non-verbal messages the liturgy conveys. And so that is really important.
Yeah. So on these general aspects of the liturgy, why should our fellow Catholics care deeply about it? I've come across many people who say that while liturgy is very important, there should never be an overemphasis in the liturgy. Are such sentiments flawed, since heaven is an eternal worship of God, right? We could say that heaven is an eternal liturgy. So, Father, what would you say to people who actually make such statements?
It is true that it is not the only aspect of the Church's life one should care about. Yes, of course. Beginning with the spiritual life, there are many non-liturgical aspects to it, the aspect of personal prayer. Then, of course, we are meant to live our faith every day in the world. We are meant to practice, the love of neighbor, and the virtues, and so on. But it is really from the worship of God that we receive the strength to do this. Here is really where our relationship with God is expressed, is nourished, is grows. That's also what Pope Benedict always emphasized in his writings. Is really this is about God and how we relate to Him, and from there everything flows. And as you say, yes, the heaven is about the eternal worship of of God, not the Mass, not the sacrifice of the Mass, because that will have ceased then, but kind of the adoration of God. And so in a way, in the liturgy, we are introduced into that heavenly worship. And in fact, we already participate in that heavenly worship. It's a great vision of the book of Revelation as a heavenly worship of God. And we already share in that somewhere. That's the Sanctus, and the preface leading to the Sanctus expresses that that truth. So yes, we should care about the way we worship.
Yes, Father, and it's also articulated in Sacrosanctum Concilium that the earthly liturgy is a foretaste of that heavenly liturgy, right? Also, Father, we often lament these days there is a lack of reverence in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. Is this a lack of understanding of what is right dispositioned that should be accorded to God? Or is it part of the zeitgeist that many Catholics have lost sight of God's transcendence and they wish to bring him down to our level, treating him like a next-door friend and being casual about it? Do you see these sentiments encroaching into the liturgical praxis of our day?
Of course, Christ calls us friends and calls us to friendship with him, so that is certainly true. That friendship with Christ is an important aspect of our spiritual life, but there is a sort of casual approach, which really does harm to the way our worship, and also really doesn't quite match up to I suppose the greatness of what is given to us in especially in Mass. I mean, we do believe it is actually the real presence of Christ, that in the sacrament we receive the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. Christ is actually truly and really present among us. I mean, that should inspire our reverence. That should even inspire a sense of awe, and we believe that is the faith of the Church. But do we really always express that in an adequate way? And do sort of informal elements, casual elements that have been introduced into the Mass really live up to that? Or when we listen to the Word of God, which is solemnly proclaimed in the Mass, again, there should be an attitude of sort of kind of reverential listening, because we do believe it's God speaking to us. And I think one problem, I think, is that too much is sort of projected into the Mass often. The Mass is meant to do so many things, a social gathering and a platform for this, that, and the other, all good causes, good things, but it's overloaded with all that. And there should be other places, there should be other spaces and times, say in the life of a parish, in the life of a community, where all these other important activities have their right and proper place, but the Mass should be in the first place about the adoration of God.
Okay, Father, so what would be the detrimental effects, right, of this lack of reverence? And why is an authentic worship of God so essential for us as human beings?
I think there's a lack of reverence weakens our faith and weakens our understanding of the faith. So, because of course we can form our faith in an intellectual way. We can read about the faith and we understand, for example, that it is the presence of Christ in the consecrated host. But the way we approach, say, the sacrament, the way we receive the sacrament, will also inform really our understanding of it. Our reverential gestures will inform our understanding of the faith. So if gestures of kneeling and genuflection go out of the window, or profound bow in some cultures, that's maybe the more appropriate way of reverencing the real presence. But if these gestures are no longer observed, it will have an effect on the way we think about the faith and the way we actually believe. So I think it weakens the faith.
Right. Father, would you say this is connected to this famous axiom called lex orandi, lex credendi, and lex vivendi?
I think so, yes. I mean, what I've described so far can be very neatly summed up in that saying, lex orandi, lex credendi. So the way we pray, the way we worship actually expresses our faith and also shapes our faith, really, and then in turn shapes our life, our Christian lives.
Okay, Father. Father, you wrote this book, A Short History of the Roman Mass. Firstly, what inspired you to write this book, and what gap in the conversation surrounding the liturgy you were hoping to address?
And the book is actually based on a larger study, a larger monograph called The Roman Mass, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. And this is a book I meant to write for some time. I sort of did some work for it. And finally, in the very difficult period of COVID-19, actually, I had the opportunity to concentrate writing on the book because of the restrictions. There was little else to do, so I actually could focus on my work on this book. And I wanted to provide a history of the stable parts of the Mass, of the order of Mass, the basic structure of the Mass, really from its formative period in antiquity, and actually begin with the Last Supper. Well, the bigger monograph takes it to the Council of Trent. See, there's a lot of liturgical studies that are concerned with more peripheral aspects of the Mass, the saints' calendar, for instance, or some particular celebrations in the liturgical year, processional elements, whatnot. I mean, it was all very good, but I wanted to look at the core rite of the Mass, how it developed, what actually remained the same, and what changed over the centuries. And so I managed to complete this book and publish it in 22. And then, in fact, it was the editor of an online journal in the US had the idea of having short chapters on the topic of this book, which published and were then which they then revised and put together in this short history of the Roman Mass, basically to give a more concise introduction, not so many footnotes, and then if anyone wants to go deeper at a certain point, there's the bigger monograph. And I think a book like that is important because I wanted to give a more up-to-date introduction to this topic, because there has been a lot of wonderful research on this subject in the last few decades by theologians, liturgists, historians, art historians, architectural historians. I just wanted to draw this together and essentially also show the remarkable continuity of the core of the Roman Mass throughout the centuries, and also show how it developed under the impact of different historical, social, cultural, religious factors.
It is indeed a very concise book to read, Father. In the opening of the book, you quoted Erasmus of Rotterdam, who championed the Renaissance humanist ideal of returning to the sources of what we call the art fontes, asserting that Christian doctrine could be drawn, quote-unquote, in a much purer and more vigorous way from the very sources. You contrasted this with St. John Henry Cardinal Newman's theory of doctrinal development, where he suggests that while the stream may be clearest at the spring, it becomes more equable and purer and stronger when its bed has become deep, broad, and full. Could you elaborate on these two perspectives and share which you find more compelling and why?
Well, the quote from Erasmus really illustrates the great project of the Renaissance humanists to go back to the early church, the sources, ad fontes. So biblical and patristic Christianity. They wanted to cut through the sort of scholastic theology of their day, which they thought was far too elaborate, too over-sophisticated, and didn't do justice to the sort of plain message of the gospel. And they thought you go back to the origins, and they're sort of pure and vigorous, more so than in any later period. However, when you look at the research into the origins of Christianity, the early centuries of Christianity, you actually find yourself confronted with quite a lot of difficulties. From the early centuries, we have few sources. And we only get kind of spotlights on certain questions, certain problems, certain practices. Even if you look at the letters of St. Paul in the New Testament, he's obviously dealing with certain problems that came up in the church in Corinth. And we'd like to know much more. We have all these questions. What's the background? What was the practice actually of the Lord's Supper? And how did these problems he has to deal with arise? But he doesn't tell us because he wasn't concerned with giving us a complete picture, but with addressing just very specific questions. And that's very similar in the first 3 centuries. And historical scholars then sometimes build up quite complicated hypotheses to try also to fill these gaps. But I think it's better to be somewhat less ambitious and say, well, there are actually a lot of things we don't know. And actually the stream does become clearer and purer only after a certain while. And that's, I think St. John Henry Newman really captured that very well. I mean, he was a great historian, and his idea of doctrinal development is perhaps his greatest contribution to Catholic theology. And I think he saw that very clearly. And I thought it would be good to contrast sort of Newman with Erasmus, and I'm definitely on the side of Newman here.
Okay, fine. In fact, so you're saying that there is a certain assumption concerning Erasmus' theory, right? That the sources are actually purer, whereas the church is an organic reality that grows and it develops. In fact, Father, Venerable Pope Pius XII actually sort of also, in a way, sided with St. John Henry Cardinal Newman's theory in saying that in media today, if I'm not wrong, he did say about, we should not make the error of liturgical archaeologism, right? Thinking that is the way to go. Yeah, because in fact, after the Second Vatican Council, if I'm not mistaken, there are ecclesial groups which actually holds to Erasmus' theory, thinking that celebrating the liturgy in the early times, right, would be the more perfect or purer form, and they have gone with that approach. Father, your thoughts?
In fact, there was a strong tendency around that time of the liturgical reform to go back to an earlier, supposedly purer form of the liturgy. So that was, for some, the Roman Rite before its sort of encounter and transformation in the Carolingian period, so 8th century, so before the 8th century, or even before the 4th century, when with the Constantinian settlement after the conversion of Constantine, the Christian liturgy adopted quite a lot of elements from Roman official practice, for example, incense and candles preceding the bishop and later also the priest in liturgical celebrations, but being carried before him. So the idea that we should go to an earlier, so supposedly then purer and more authentic form of the Christian liturgy. And just one example, Eucharistic prayer number 2 in the present Missal. And I think it shows actually the difficulties of such an approach and also the historical traps you can fall into. At the time of Vatican II, it was widely believed, scholars really thought this was the case, that this prayer is actually the earliest accessible Eucharistic prayer of the Roman Church, known from a document called the Apostolic Tradition, written by Saint Hippolytus of Rome, martyr, Pope, has set himself up as an anti-pope, but then, died a martyr and venerated as a saint. And dating from the early 3rd century. That was truly believed by most scholars at the time. In the meantime, historical scholars have poked holes into all of this, and now it's quite widely believed that the document is not from the 3rd century, but later, has different layers which we can't really neatly separate one from another, but maybe late 3rd century, maybe early 4th century. B, that it certainly doesn't come from Rome, but rather from perhaps Syria or Egypt, but sort of from the Eastern Mediterranean. And C, was not written or compiled by Saint Hippolytus. Now, this document not only gave the model for a Eucharistic prayer number 2, but also for the revision of the Catholic Christian initiation for adults, what then became the RCIA. So you can't just simply take the latest sort of historical reconstructions and hypotheses and build your sort of liturgical foundation on it, with the idea that you're going back to the earlier and purer sources. It's actually in the 4th century when we have the first witnesses to the Roman canon of the Mass, the first Eucharistic prayer, that we truly have sort of reliable witnesses for the Roman tradition. Also, I think, of course, there is a way in which we do look to the apostolic age as normative in a way. We do look to the apostolic age for inspiration, for the renewal of the church. In fact, the Oratorians of the 16th century also did that. There was the idea that St. Philip Neri actually revived the apostolic practice with his particular sort of meetings, prayer, singing, sort of some discourses, which we call oratory. But it doesn't mean that you can sort of set aside or ignore, even reject anything that's been that's happened in between, that's happened since. That's the whole point about what you said, organic development or development in or reform in continuity. That this is actually part of the history of the Church and the sort of continuity of Christ's work of salvation.
Yes. So it's almost like there is a seed form of the liturgy in the early times, but it has the potential to grow into that full budding tree. And we can't just discard everything along the way. And we are like sort of reverse engineering everything.
Yes. And as you mentioned engineering, and Pope Benedict used those very images. He said the Pope, as in terms of liturgy, should be like a gardener. So there may be the need to prune something, to cut something back a bit, and to make a few interventions so that the tree or the plant can grow better, can grow fuller. But it's not like the work of an engineer, where you simply sort of replace a machine with another, or throw out a machine that doesn't work anymore and construct a new one.
Okay, thanks, Father, for this insight. Also in your book, you question the commonly accepted narrative about the development of the Roman Rite, which claims that the liturgy of the Western Church moved from early dynamic development through medieval decline to early modern stagnation and was only revived in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. Could you elaborate what you believe has been misunderstood and what is the accurate narrative which needs to be reclaimed in current liturgical scholarship?
I mean, that narrative is tied up with the idea of a kind of original purity or original sort of authenticity of the liturgy, and I wanted to challenge that really. So the idea that in the first few centuries there was this dynamic development which then became more and more kind of perhaps not just fossilized, but even sort of declined, especially in the medieval period, and then simply stagnated after the Council of Trent. And so one of the things I've tried to do is look at the later medieval period and try to understand how the Mass was celebrated and how people participated in it and experienced the Mass, because it's often argued that this was a period when the people were estranged from the Mass, when they had no understanding of it. It was, of course, in Latin, which they didn't speak, so they weren't really involved in it. And I try to show that, well, in fact, they were. And they found many ways in participating in the Mass. Of course, Latin was to some extent an obstacle, but even that wasn't as rigid as it's often conceived. I mean, people were very much shaped by the liturgy and went to Mass, as in medieval Europe, often not just on Sundays but also on weekdays. So they would be familiar with the parts of the Mass. They would have some understanding of it. They wouldn't be able to, say, translate the prayers of a particular Sunday, but they had some understanding of it and found ways, visual participation through images, the music. So also that there were actually vernacular elements. There were vernacular bidding prayers, intercessions. Preaching actually was much more common than it's often thought, especially in the later Middle Ages. So people were very much actually involved in the life of their parishes, and so it wasn't simply a period of decline as is always thought. Then when we come to the post-Tridentine period, it is true that you there have a codification of ritual which is quite singular in the history of the liturgy. So really there's very little sort of development of the actual rites. They become standardized, and with the invention of printing, sort of the same liturgical books can be produced really for the whole world in the same way and at a much reduced cost by comparison to producing a manuscript. And I mean, there I think more work still needs to be done, and my bigger monograph stops with a trend. Otherwise, it would have been even longer, and I thought this was a good place to stop. Maybe I'll write a second volume at some point, not immediately, but in a few years' time. I think one would need to look more at how people experienced the Mass, how the liturgy, how they participated in it, and for that project, one would need to look not just at properly liturgical sources, liturgical books, but at a wider range of literature. So that's there's still some work to be done. But basically, the big picture is then you have decline, stagnation, and only in the 20th century the liturgy was really revived. And I think that's a very pretentious way of looking at liturgical history. I mean, even before the 20th century liturgical reforms, people had a very lively sense of the church's worship. Really were nourished in the lives of faith. And many saints, of course, came out of that period, and although they didn't quite participate in the way in which we are used to participate, in quite a bit of which often a kind of cerebral way, if that's the right way of putting it. We want to understand everything. On a different level, they did understand, and if they were actually truly rooted in the faith, they maybe even understood better what was happening in the Mass.
As you were sharing, Father, it reminded me of this buzzword at Vatican II. It's called aggiornamento, right? That suddenly at Vatican II, the church came alive, and everything in the past was bad, and suddenly now we are headed towards a new springtime of the church. Yeah, and you reminded me of that, and as you were sharing about challenging that particular narrative. Yeah. Father, let's move on to Vatican II and the Roman Rite of today. You addressed the varied reactions to the Second Vatican Council. On one side, some see the reforms of the liturgy as a much-needed quote-unquote modernization, while others lament a perceived departure from the auspices of tradition. What do you think is the most appropriate way to understand the relationship between the older and newer forms of Holy Mass?
Well, there seem to be two quite radically opposed schools of thought on this. On one side, you have the idea that the older form of the Mass is really no longer compatible with what the Church now believes and teaches, so that it's essentially not compatible with the teaching of Vatican II, both theologically and liturgically, that it's especially also the understanding of the Church ecclesiology of Vatican II has superseded the older form of the Mass. On the other side, you have those who say only the older form of the Mass is really the full form of the Roman Rite and needs to be restored fully. I don't agree with either of these positions, really. I mean, my view would be that what Pope Benedict tried to promote, really, by proposing sort of two forms of the one Roman Rite. So that there is, and so I do believe there is an essential continuity between the old and the new form. Especially also if you look at the order of Mass, the basic structure of Mass, which I'm so particularly interested in my book. Obviously, that has been changed, has been reformed in some times, but the basic structure is still there. But I think it's also essential that Vatican II, Sacrosanctum Concilium, is fully compatible with the older form of the Mass. And that its theological principles, its basic liturgical kind of teaching, actually does in no way contradict the actual Mass, which, as it was still celebrated, at least at the beginning of the Second Vatican Council. So, of course, there have been changes and reforms, and I can see. I can understand also the need for some of these reforms. Say, if you find me in the year, say, 1962 or 1960, but question then is also how these reforms are interpreted today, and I think it would be time for a sort of review of these reforms, and see where they have worked well and where they haven't worked well in the light of Sacrosanctum Concilium, where we've actually followed the Sacrosanctum Concilium, and where we haven't, where there needs to be a new a new consideration, I suppose, of that document. So in a way, sort of an updated reading of Sacrosanctum Concilium. I think that would be needed today.
Yes, Father, I agree with you. In fact, Pope Benedict XVI was trying very hard to help us to understand this whole hermeneutic of continuity, that the faith is one and the same in substance. There cannot be a rupture in any way. But it does seem sometimes, right, or in an apparent level on the liturgical praxis, that there is that stark departure. And that's where the critics are pushing back. Your thoughts on this, Father?
Yes, the hermeneutic of reading the Vatican II is a key question in this, and I think the liturgy, in some sense, is has been made the kind of test of that hermeneutic. Unfortunately, and it shouldn't be really such an area of controversy, but it has been so, and I think we do need some form of reconciliation here, but in the first place, actually, one will need to recognize, I think, that essential continuity of the Church before and after Vatican II. And, there are all sorts of transformations and changes which always happen in the history of the Church, but it's not that everything was sort of invented in the 1960s.
You rightly pointed out about the necessity of rereading the documents, because most of the time people don't read the actual text of the documents as to what Vatican II actually said, right? And unfortunately, this happens on the both extreme camps, right? And it's so necessary, especially in the area of formation, for us to really deepen our understanding of what Vatican II really taught. The richness of the council, right? Since it's a dogmatic council. And so, Father, moving from this aspect, I would like to talk a little bit on Sacrosanctum itself, that calls for the use of Latin and Gregorian chant. Unfortunately, we rarely see these in parishes today. In fact, in most of the parishes that I've been to in my country, you hear Gregorian chant few and far between in the masses. And there were also these rapid changes in the years following Vatican II. What would you say to those who are of those sentiments that Latin has little benefits, since most people these days do not even understand what they are singing, and this, to them, it becomes a lack in worship? Do you agree with such sentiments?
Well, I guess what's to distinguish here, if you look at, say, the ordinary of the Mass, surely if you go to Mass with some regularity, you will become familiar with the ordinary. Kyrie, Sanctus, the Creed, and when then it is proposed that you should sing that ordinary in Latin, in one of the Gregorian chant masses, begin with the Angelus. Well, I don't it's so demanding on your understanding whether you sing, holy, 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 or sanctus, sanctus, sanctus. I mean, that doesn't seem to me such an obstacle in our understanding, or even the Our Father. That's a prayer which everyone should know, and if you sing it in a solemn Latin mass in Latin, surely you have some understanding of it. And we live in a global village now. It's a bit ironic that at the time when many people, at least in Europe, never sort of left the immediate area where they were living, the villages, perhaps the town where they were living, the mass was all in Latin, and now where people are traveling constantly, we have so little Latin. I think Latin could really be a common language here. See, when I go to another country and I want to go to mass, okay, I speak Italian, that's fine. But if I go to Croatia, I don't understand a word, let alone going to Asian countries. So and of course, and vice versa. So there is in this global village, there is, I think, an important place for Latin. And then at international gatherings, say in Rome now for the Holy Year, or elsewhere in Lourdes, it is actually a beautiful experience if Catholics meet together and can meet and can sing, the Gloria or the Creed together in Latin. So I always thought that, particularly in the moment in which we are living now, Latin would have an important place. And of course, leaving that sort of more practical consideration aside, it does connect us with our tradition. It is the sacred language of the Latin Rite, of the Latin Rite Church. And we have this phenomenon of a sacred language in so many religious traditions. I mean, the sacred scriptures in a synagogue are still read in Hebrew, although any Jew will actually have to learn that language. Even say in Israel, the modern version of Hebrew is quite different from the ancient Hebrew. You have to learn that language. I mean, you have the sacred scriptures of Hindus in Sanskrit. So I mean, there is still the idea that a sacred language connects us with that greater tradition, and that is something important to keep alive today.
It is also my own personal anecdotal experience that Latin is a very powerful unifying language. I was at World Youth Day in Krakow in 2016, and I attended the opening mass. In the big open field, and of course, surrounding me were people of all different nationalities, and I was experiencing firstly the universality of the church. And when it came to mass, because the ordinaries were sung in Latin, I could participate because I had learned that common language. And in fact, after I had sung, the Europeans that were surrounding me looked at me, and suddenly it almost in an instant, it became an opening door for conversation and for the start of a friendship. It was as though we have known each other for a long time, and we all just felt at home together after the mass. And and that was really because I very much believe that, because I spoke that common language with my fellow Catholics around the world. Yeah, and so this is my own personal experience. Yeah, as you're sharing, Father.
And maybe another reflection about the question of understanding. I mean, it's beautiful to have such an experience, and I think that's a real treasure. And you can make it at World Youth Day, and said in Lourdes and in Rome,
But another reflection on understanding. I mean, what do we really understand when we hear, for instance, the Eucharistic prayer in the vernacular? I mean, we're in favor of the vernacular. We have most of our masses here in English, and have no problem with that at all. And I consider it also important in today's world. But if you just reflect on what do you actually understand, if, say, you hear the whole Eucharistic prayer, you need to have some form, some formation, some catechetical, perhaps mystagogical formation in order to understand what is said. And I mean, there have been, especially say with the previous English translation, attempts to simplify the language, to modernize it. But even so, even if you try to simplify it, there will still be biblical ideas, theological concepts, expressions, which you can only understand if you have some understanding of the Catholic faith already. If you have been catechized to a considerable degree, actually, you look at the Eucharistic prayer. So we always say, it must be in a vernacular, people must understand, but what do you actually understand when you hear that? I think this, we have a far too sort of superficial conception of understanding the Mass here. I think if you really want to stand, it's much more important that you are properly catechized, that you have some good grasp of the faith and of what happens at Mass, and that will give you the prerequisites for a better understanding, but not necessarily hearing the prayers in the vernacular. Say not necessarily. I think that, of course, you have the chance, you can read it, you can study it. It's much more difficult if it's in Latin, yes. But on the other hand, the sacred language has a kind of, it does have a kind of, it has a transcendent atmosphere. It has a sort of mystical power, I think, which can draw people in and also gives in a sense that something really important is happening there and make them curious to inquire more what it is.
Absolutely, Father. You were spot on in that particular analysis. So we often hear people quoting Vatican II, and this is what we call the false spirit of Vatican II. More often than not, like these are not really stated in the document. So on the use of Latin and Gregorian chant, in fact, Sacrosanctum Concilium actually states that the Church acknowledges Gregorian chant especially suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things equal, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services. So the council actually highlights Gregorian chant, right, as that model of music. What is it about chant that makes it so fitting in the liturgy compared to other musical styles?
Gregorian chant is, I find, a most extraordinary creation, really, at a time when, the cultural power of sort of Western Europe wasn't that great. I mean, the Western European societies were far behind in cultural terms, far behind, say, the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, the Islamic culture at the time is really quite backwards in many ways, and it was at that time that the monks created this extraordinary musical medium for the liturgy. I think part of it is. It's so intimately wedded to the words. It gives such a profound spiritual interpretation to the largely biblical text, and most chants are actually based on biblical text. There are a few other poetic compositions, but most are from that, certainly from that early formative period. And it creates really a sacred musical expression. The Gregorian chant was not the ordinary musical expression at the time. When people were in a tavern drinking, they didn't sing Gregorian chant. They had, sort of drinking songs, whatever they may have had. Or when they were celebrating otherwise, they didn't sing Gregorian chant. It was a sacred music already from its very beginning, and it sounded sort of strange, or sounded sort of perhaps mystical or transcendent already to the ears of Charlemagne, or whoever may have been around at the time. And it has a certain austerity, I suppose, especially compared to later musical forms. I think these are some aspects that make it really make it, as the Council says, I don't think it's just the proper chant. I think that's what the Council is really, the proper music of the Roman Rite.
Yeah, Father, and it's heartening these days that I've seen many pockets of groups who are trying to recover this tradition of the faith. And I notice it actually amongst many young people who have never been exposed to this rich heritage of the church. We do see that these are the signs of the times where that there's something beautiful in the sacred that is drawing people in that direction. It is because against the what is happening in the world today, right, it seems that the traditions of the church is what that grounds us. It gives us a certain stability in our faith and in life in general. Although moving on, we talk about Mass rubrics, and how do you see them? Do we see them as mere guidelines, especially on the part of the priest? I can share also from many of my own personal experiences that I've seen priests giving prelude, such as homilies right at the start of Mass, and a common sentiment, and unfortunately, sadly, this comes from the clergy, is that following Mass rubrics too closely is a form of Pharisaic legalism. Would you agree with those statements?
Well, I suppose the background to that attitude is the overly legalistic understanding of the liturgy, which was prevalent until, say, the first half of the 20th century. There was a rather scrupulous attitude towards the rubrics, and also not just scrupulous, but there was a kind of an attitude that really saw these rubrics just as kind of external laws that had to be fulfilled to the letter, but didn't really perhaps understand their place, their meaning in the context of the liturgical celebration. So there was something like a legalistic attitude towards the liturgy. But that doesn't mean that the rubrics themselves are simply to be ignored. I think they are important. They are essential for the rite to work, and we're talking here about a rite, a ritual, and a ritual is guided by a certain rigidity, repetition. Otherwise, it doesn't work as ritual, and so and also the faithful. I think it's really the people can expect a certain standard, let's put it that way, of liturgical celebration. That's exactly what the rubrics are for, not in a legalistic way, but you see, it's the priest doesn't own a liturgical celebration. It's not his private property. He can dispense with as he likes, but it's the church, and the church sort of lays down a certain way of celebrating it. So I think that is really there's that is, as I said, it's essential for a ritual, for the worship of the church, that there should be fidelity to rubrics. So one concept that has been promoted in the last few years is Ars Celebrandi, which means a priest should cultivate a certain standard of celebrating. It's not which is of course, but that is linked to the rubrics. It's and it's always. So it's never, interestingly, it's usually used in the way of Ars Celebrandi. It's never said the art of celebrating, because that would get us into really a wrong understanding of it. It's not meant to be sort of creative and original and innovative and new and everything. But Ars comes from is Latin for, and the Greek equivalent is techne. So there is an element of almost, it's a bit like a trade. It's a bit like a skill that needs to be acquired. So, which follows certain rules, certain patterns, and that applies to the Mass as well. You actually you need to learn how to celebrate Mass, and you need to learn it. And there are certain rules in there, and there's nothing to do with legalism, but that's just in its very nature. And I don't think seminaries are always doing their job properly, really, in actually also teaching seminarians, well, just about how to celebrate a Mass. And you need to learn it, you need to practice a bit, and that's the nature of the liturgy.
In fact, Father, when you were sharing about there were those legalistic attitudes, it's almost like you don't throw the baby together out with the bathwater, right? You help to correct those attitudes and help to form them under the guidance of right spirituality, so that priests would celebrate the Mass out of love, right? Because since the liturgy is a gift from God, it's not man-made. Right, in that fidelity of following the rubrics is a manifestation of that love for God. I would put it that way. Another debatable issue is concerning active participation. Right? This term was first coined, if I'm not wrong, by Pope St. Pius X in Tra le Sollecitudini, in his document on sacred music. But today, that common understanding of active participation has been widely misconstrued. Father, why is it that such a misconstrued understanding has resulted over the years? Because it seems that it's reduced to just mere external and exterior action. What is erroneous about this line of understanding between liturgical activism versus liturgical participation? And how would you address those who hold to these erroneous views?
I suppose the misunderstanding can come from the attribute active, and that's then confused with activism. So some liturgical scholars have tried to argue that actuosa participatio means more like actual participation rather than active participation. I don't think the argument works on the mere linguistic ground, because actuosa means active, really. And Pope Pius X speaks of partecipazione attiva. He wrote the document you mentioned in Italian originally. So, I mean, there is an element of activity there, but it's really striking how it has been interpreted, because I looked into this question actually for something else, and Josef Andreas Jungmann, the great Austrian Jesuit liturgist, who was a peritus at the council, and who wrote a commentary on Sacrosanctum Concilium in the mid-60s, so not long after the actual event, says in this commentary very clearly, in the first place, this means actually interior participation, which comes from the common priesthood of the baptized, and their sharing in the offering of the Eucharist. So by virtue of your baptismal priesthood, you actually join in the offering of the Eucharistic sacrifice. So it is an interior attitude, disposition, which then expresses itself, of course, in certain liturgical actions, responding and perhaps singing and so on. But it begins as an interior attitude, and really has been reduced to just doing things. Also, sometimes it does just involves certain people in the assembly, in the liturgical assembly, doing things. And not by no means everyone. So had the path which Jungmann indicated been followed, it would have saved us a lot of trouble, I think. And a lot of ink has been spilled on this question. Again, as Pope Benedict tried to sort of reactivate really the more interior interpretation of that principle. Wrote beautifully about what it truly means. But it certainly doesn't necessarily mean doing things. And I think part of the attractiveness of the older Mass, older liturgical forms, especially for younger people today, is that they are uncomfortable with the constant emphasis on activism and doing things, that they want the more contemplative, meditative aspect, which is clearer so much clearer in the older form of the Mass. I think that's part of the reason, one of the reasons that attracts them to the older form.
I sing in the choir back in Singapore, and there were times where the choir is supposed to be singing the parts of the Mass, for example, the Sanctus, but I could be so moved that I couldn't utter those words out, right? But yet I know that I am participating, in fact, on a much deeper level, because I'm moved by the realities and the mysteries of whatever that is taking place at a point in time. Yeah, so far, I personally have encountered and understood what Mother Church is teaching about, of what this actual participation really meant. Yeah, and you were talking about how many young people today are drawn towards the more traditional and the older forms of the Mass, and certainly is gaining traction around the world. In fact, maybe I wouldn't even talk about maybe the Mass of Pope John the 23rd. Maybe I just focus on the Mass of Pope Paul VI. I see many young people are drawn towards the celebration ad Orientem. In fact, they see it on that liturgical praxis level, a more fitting way of expressing the rubrics. In fact, I chanced upon the rubrics some years back, and I realized that there are parts where it says the priest turns towards the people and says the following. And I was pondering, why would the priest need to turn towards the people if he is already facing the people? Wouldn't the normative way of celebration of the Missal of Pope Paul VI indicate that Mass is celebrated ad Orientem?
Well, yes, I agree. I mean, that's what I also tried to show in my book, Turning Towards the Lord, which is quite a few years old now. And so, yes, that's my understanding of the rubrics too.
So, Father, if We know from Sacrosanctum also that the celebration of the liturgy is the source and summit. Yet, unfortunately, that which is supposed to be the unifying element of our faith has become most polarizing these days. And so we heard a lot of things about the liturgical wars that's happening. There is a myriad of liturgical opinions, and which hardly is grounded in whatever the document says itself. How do we navigate this conflicting narratives?
I would say above all in charity and patience. I think we certainly need we need the charity to diffuse the sometimes very polemical tone of these liturgical conflicts. It's when I don't often follow discussion, especially online, but you do sometimes. I sometimes get the impression that those who participate in them are quite quick in attributing bad intentions to those with whom they disagree, and I think that is certainly to be avoided. A lot of decisions with which I don't agree, I can still recognize were made in good faith and based on perhaps the scholarship at the time. I mentioned earlier the case of the second Eucharistic prayer, the so-called anaphora of Hippolytus. It seemed quite a reasonable position to think that this was the earliest witness to the Roman liturgy in the early 1960s. So there was a genuine attempt to sort of seek for perhaps an earlier Roman tradition, and I think one should recognize the sincerity in this, even when you don't agree with the outcome. So giving the benefit of the doubt, approaching in charity and also in patience, because these problems won't be solved immediately, and good things also take time to develop. So that would be one suggestion, really. And also it's useful, I think, to take the long view. I mean, I teach church history, and I find that very useful in many ways in approaching the great debates and conflicts of our day, because it relativizes, what we think is sort of the gravity of our situations, and there have been other crises, there have been other difficulties, and the church pulled through and then entered into a period of calm growth again.
Thank you very much for that very, very wise advice, Father. I fully agree that at the heart of it is charity in those conversations, and because many times even the errors that people hold may not be of malicious intent, that they were formed and they were probably a product of their own formation of a particular time. Yeah, Father, I'd like to turn to that last page of turning towards the Lord, where you actually said, concerning the character of the Eucharist and worship, you said, it is fitting to explain clearly that the expression to celebrate facing the people has no theological sense, but is only a topographical concept. Because since every celebration of the Eucharist is always facing God and facing people, in the form of celebration, one must be careful to avoid confounding theology and topography, especially when the priest is at the altar. It is only in the dialogues from the altar that the priest speaks to the people. All the rest is prayer to the Father through the mediation of Christ in the Holy Spirit, and that this theology must be visible. Father, so concerning, because we often hear this term of versus populum, right? That Mass is very commonly celebrated versus populum. So I found that this particular part helps us to sort of realign our understanding that worship is always, first and foremost, firstly directed to God. And it's only from there that we learn how to be able to love our brothers and sisters in an authentic manner. And oftentimes that is reversed, unfortunately. Yeah. Lastly, for Catholics who wish to develop a deeper appreciation in authentic liturgical studies, what are some basic resources you would recommend for them as starters?
I certainly recommend, unsurprisingly, the writings of Pope Benedict XVI. The volume on the liturgy, theology of the liturgy, is the only volume so far of his collected works that has been translated into English. Now the project is on the way, but so far only that volume is available. The Spirit of the Liturgy is a wonderful book, an important book, which really changed. It was a game changer, really. So that I think that would be a very good place to start. And it depends what you are interested in. If it is a more speculative theological reflection on the liturgy or historical studies. So, for example, in my book, The Short History of the Roman Mass, I list at the end have a few recommendations where you can follow up various aspects. But there is quite a lot of very good liturgical scholarship being done at the moment. So I'm hopeful that this will bring its fruit in its time.
Thank you very much, Father. I appreciate all the recommendations. Lastly, Father, are there any particular works that you are undertaking at the moment?
Well, I have a long-term project for a book. There's so much else to do at the moment that I haven't had the time to pursue it really in the last few months. But I am working on a book on the liturgical veneration of the Holy Face of Christ, which was really prompted by the veneration of the Veil of Veronica in St. Peter's, Pope Innocent III in the 13th century, and that really triggered a great veneration for the face of Christ, also in liturgical form. So you have quite a few votive masses from many different sources on this veneration, and it's quite diversified. You have on the one hand a veneration of the glorious face of Christ, the transfigured face of Christ, and then you have the suffering face of Christ. And the later you go, the more and more it becomes a passion devotion. But in the Middle Ages, it's also really the glorified face of Christ that is much venerated. And so I want to pull this all together, even going into the 20th century. I mean, there are places where the great devotion to the Holy Face of Christ in Manopello, in Italy, in Alicante, and in Jaén in Spain. So, and I think this would be quite of interest also for seeing how popular devotion and the liturgy interact and sort of influence each other.
It is very wonderful to hear all these exciting works underway, Father. And personally, I'm very grateful to you for all these contributions in this particular field. I mean, I'm personally a big fan of yours, as you can see. That's why I've purchased. I'm someone who likes to purchase hard copies because I see the value in them. Yeah. Father, are there any travel plans in the near future in Asia or in this region?
Possibly, yes. In fact, a Chinese translation of Turning Towards the Lord is in preparation. And it might come out this year, actually. And I would travel to Hong Kong, Macau for that. It's quite possible that I could make a stop in Singapore as well.
Oh, we're very happy to hear that. Most happy to welcome you to our homeland. Yeah. Father, it's been such an engaging conversation. It's such a pleasure to have you on this podcast, and I look forward to having a chat with you sometime again. Thank you very much, Father Michael.
You as well. Thank you. God bless.